The night shift at Seattle General started the way it always did, with Sarah Chen arriving through the emergency entrance at 11:48 p.m., her badge clipped to scrubs that had been washed so many times the fabric had gone soft, almost translucent at the seams. The hospital exhaled around her, that particular smell of antiseptic and something darker underneath, something like metal and resignation. She moved through the corridors with a kind of invisible efficiency that made people forget she'd been in the room the moment she left it. Her captain's rank, her 3 Air Force commendations, her 2 tours in Kandahar, all of it was buried now, filed away under a civilian nursing license that said Sarah M. Chen, RN, as if the M stood for something ordinary and forgettable instead of the woman who'd performed a field thoracotomy with a combat knife under mortar fire when the forward operating base's surgeon was 2 clicks away and bleeding out fast. The night shift supervisor, Marcus, no relation to the incoming patient she'd learn about in 4 minutes, handed her the assignment sheet with barely a glance. Room 347. Trauma admission from 0400 hours. Colonel Marcus Vance, Air Force, 5 gunshot wounds. The wounds were arranged in a pattern. Sarah's eyes read like a military briefing, entry points clustered on the left side of the torso, consistent with a professional assassination attempt rather than random violence. Someone had wanted this man dead with professional precision. Someone had failed. The Department of Defense had moved him to San Antonio's quietest hospital, asked for their quietest night shift nurse, and Sarah had already understood without being told. This wasn't a standard admission. This was a watch. This was a surveillance assignment wrapped in hospital scrubs. She reached room 347 at 11:52 p.m. and found Colonel Vance already in bed, the kind of still that comes from morphine and exhaustion and the particular silence of a man trained to give nothing away. 5 bullet wounds meant 5 separate dressing changes, 5 separate opportunities to assess. His left shoulder bore the first entry wound, the surgical site clean but taut with the tension of new sutures. His ribs on the left side were wrapped in compression bandaging. The other 3 wounds tracked down his abdomen in a professional line, each one handled by surgeons who knew what they were doing, which meant the hospital's chief surgical officer, Dr. Mercer, had overseen the trauma response. Sarah had already heard the whispers about Mercer, the way he'd billed the emergency room for procedures he hadn't personally performed, the way the equipment charges always seemed inflated by exactly 20%, the phantom supplies that appeared on invoices but never materialized in the supply room. Captain or not, nurse or not, Sarah had learned to notice patterns. It was a survival skill. Colonel Vance's jacket lay on the visitor's chair, standard Air Force blue, the kind issued to officers who flew combat missions. Sarah hung it in the small closet beside the bed and began her intake assessment, running her hands along the fabric with the practiced touch of someone checking for contraband, for weapons, for anything that didn't belong. Her fingers found it during the 3rd pass along the inside lining, a small patch, maybe 2 inches square, worn soft from decades of contact with skin. She held it to the fluorescent light and felt something cold settle in her chest. A faded unit insignia from a Black Ops unit that officially didn't exist. Not NSA. Not CIA, something darker, something that didn't have a name on any organizational chart. She documented it in her assessment note separately, in a subsection marked Personal Effects, Classified Origin, Understanding, without being told that this colonel wasn't just a patient. This was the kind of assignment that came with briefings she'd never attend and consequences she'd already accepted before taking the job. The first dressing change happened at 1:15 a.m., when room 347 was sealed against the rest of the ICU and Sarah's hands moved through the procedure with the kind of muscle memory that came from field conditions, from makeshift hospitals, from the particular pressure of knowing that steady hands meant the difference between a patient who lived and a patient who didn't. She removed the old dressing from his left shoulder with precise movements, each motion economical, nothing wasted. The wound was healing clean, no signs of infection, no drainage patterns that suggested complications. She cleaned it with sterile saline, her touch firm enough to remove debris but gentle enough not to disturb the suture line. Muscle memory took over. Her breathing stayed steady. Her hands didn't shake. Colonel Vance watched her work from beneath half-closed eyes. "You served," he said, his voice rough from intubation, from recovery, from 3 days of intensive care. It wasn't a question. I can tell by the way you handle tissue under pressure. You're no ordinary nurse. Sarah didn't respond. She'd learned long ago that silence was safer than confirmation, that the best cover was the one nobody thought to penetrate. She packed the wound with fresh gauze using a technique she'd learned not in nursing school but in a combat field hospital where the difference between infection and survival came down to the angle of the dressing and the pressure of the hands holding it. The fluorescent lights hummed their particular fluorescent hum, and somewhere down the corridor a ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, and for a moment Sarah felt the weight of the assignment press down on her shoulders like gravity. The next 4 hours proceeded with the particular rhythm of night shift, vital sign checks every 2 hours, the constant calculation of medication timing, the assessment of wound drainage and fluid balance. Sarah moved through her duties with the kind of careful attention that created a paper trail without her realizing anyone was reading it. She noticed the duplicate billing code on Mercer's original trauma order, 2 units of whole blood at $847 each, but the blood bank log showed only 1 unit transfused. She noticed the phantom equipment charge, a $12,400 external fixation device listed on the invoice, but Colonel Vance's X-ray showed only standard surgical plates. She noticed the inflated surgical supply costs, the phantom sutures, the impossible quantities of sterile gauze that never appeared in the supply inventory. Dr. Mercer swept through the ICU at 4:33 a.m., the kind of entrance that announced itself before his shoes touched the floor. His watch, a Rolex Submariner, probably $14,000, the kind that announced itself before the man wearing it opened his mouth, caught the fluorescent light as he reviewed Colonel Vance's chart. His entourage followed 2 steps behind, residents and junior surgeons who'd learned to mirror his confidence, which Sarah understood now wasn't confidence at all but rather the particular arrogance of a man who'd gotten away with something long enough to forget it was actually a crime. He pulled up the trauma summary on the computer outside room 347, ran his eyes across Sarah's notes with the kind of quick scan that suggested he wasn't actually reading them, just glancing to confirm they matched his narrative. The suturing on the left shoulder looks good, Mercer said to the resident beside him, his voice carrying the kind of casual authority that came from assuming no one would contradict him. Standard trauma response. The patient stable. No complications anticipated. He tapped the chart closed with the kind of finality that suggested the conversation, and the case, was finished. Sarah was at the medication cart 3 feet away, drawing up the 0600 morphine dose with the precision that came from thousands of repetitions. She didn't look up. She didn't react. She simply continued her work, her hand steady as a surgical laser, her face showing nothing. That was the moment Dr. Mercer first noticed her, really noticed her, not just as part of the ICU landscape but as a variable he hadn't accounted for. Sarah could feel it in the small shift of air pressure when he glanced her direction, in the half-second pause before he turned back to his residence. She'd been invisible for 4 hours. Now she was something else entirely. She was a nurse who read charts carefully enough to catch discrepancies. She was a nurse whose documentation was meticulous enough that every inflated billing code, every phantom procedure, every impossible equipment charge would eventually surface during an audit. She was, without knowing it yet, a threat to an empire that had been built on very specific assumptions about hospital infrastructure and very specific certainties about who actually paid attention. The room went dead silent. Not the silence of the ICU at night. That was always there, that steady ambient silence of machines and low voices and the particular quiet of people trying to heal in the dark. This was a different silence. A silence where Dr. Mercer had stopped moving. A silence where his residents had stopped breathing. A silence that lasted maybe 3 seconds but felt longer, the kind of silence that comes right before someone realizes they've made a tactical error and is about to begin calculating the cost. The silence stretched across room 347 like a held breath before a storm. Colonel Vance's daughter, a civilian attorney with her father's sharp eyes and sharper instincts, had just finished reading the itemized surgical supply charge on her tablet, her finger tracing the same line twice. $5,000. For gauze and sterile saline solution. Used yesterday. And today. Identical quantities. Identical codes. Doctor, she said, her voice the kind of calm that precedes legal action, can you explain why my father was charged $4,000 twice for the same supplies in a 24-hour period? Sarah stood beside the bed, adjusting the flow rate with the mechanical precision she'd perfected over 3 tours in field hospitals where you learn to move while chaos erupted around you. She didn't look up from the drip chamber. The medication flowed at exactly 45 milliliters per hour. The numbers mattered. Everything mattered. Dr. Mercer appeared in the doorway within 90 seconds, fast enough that Sarah knew he'd been monitoring the room, waiting. His smile materialized first, that practiced expression of benevolent authority he'd refined across 23 years of unchallenged power. A simple clerical error, he said, stepping into the room with the ease of a man who'd never encountered resistance he couldn't dismiss. These things happen in a hospital this size. Billing department sometimes double codes routine supplies. Colonel Vance's daughter didn't smile back. Then you won't mind correcting it immediately? Of course not. Mercer turned to Sarah with an expression like a teacher addressing a gifted but troublesome student. Nurse Chen, a word outside, please. It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered with just enough courtesy to make refusal seem insubordinate. Sarah finished adjusting the flow, made a precise notation on the chart, time, rate, patient response, and followed him into the corridor. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with the irritating constancy of institutional electricity, and she could smell the antiseptic tang of hospital-grade cleaner mixed with something darker underneath, the faint copper iron smell of blood from the trauma bay 3 rooms down. Mercer didn't wait for privacy. He turned on her right there in the hallway where the colonel's family could hear every word through the open door. I'm fascinated by your sudden expertise in hospital billing, he said, his voice dripping condescension like honey poured over broken glass. Did your nursing degree include a minor in healthcare administration, or are you just another checklist nurse who thinks reading a chart makes her qualified to question physicians? His jaw worked as he spoke, anger simmering beneath the polished words. He'd built something here, a system that moved like clockwork, where billing codes translated into equipment contracts, and equipment contracts translated into kickbacks laundered through subsidiary companies. The margins were elegant. The risk was minimal. Until someone started noticing. Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Just a slight clench at the hinge, barely visible, the kind of restraint that came from years of taking fire without returning it. Her hands remained steady. Her face stayed stone. She continued adjusting the flow rate as if he hadn't spoken, finishing a notation on the chart with perfect penmanship, the letters formed by muscle memory, her consciousness already several moves ahead. The duplicate charge is documented in the patient record, Doctor, she said quietly, her voice flat as clinical baseline. Standard protocol requires flagging for billing review. Mercer's face reddened. Not from embarrassment, he didn't have enough conscience for that, but from the recognition that she'd violated an unspoken rule. She was supposed to retreat. To apologize. To accept his authority and never question it again. Instead, she doubled down on facts. Your protocol is to follow orders, not audit them, he said, his voice rising now, losing some of its measured professionalism. Consider this your only warning about overstepping your qualifications. He turned back toward the room, paused, and delivered the final line with the precision of someone who'd learned how to wound without leaving visible marks. Clearly, the night shift isn't the right environment for you. We'll be making some reassignments. The aftermath arrived with surgical efficiency. Sarah entered the break room at 1,300 hours, standard lunch break, nothing that would raise flags. For nurses were mid-conversation near the refrigerator, discussing the rotation changes, someone's wedding next month, the usual exhausted camaraderie of people who worked nights together. The moment Sarah's badge clipped against the doorframe, the conversation stopped like a recording interrupted mid-sentence. One nurse, Jennifer, who Sarah had worked alongside for 14 months without incident, gathered her container of pasta salad. Another followed. Then the third. Then the fourth. They didn't rush. They didn't make a show of it. They simply collected their things in synchronized silence and left, not even pretending to finish sentences. One of them, Sarah thought it was Marcus from ICU, made a small grimace that might have been apology or might have been fear. Sarah sat at the table alone. Ate her meal methodically. Tuna sandwich, apple, coffee black. The maintenance worker who arrived to change the bulletin board behind her didn't acknowledge her presence. She didn't acknowledge his. But she watched his hands as he removed the old announcements and pinned up new ones, because hands told stories if you knew how to read them. The new posting went up at 1,447 hours. Nurse S. Chen, unauthorized chart corrections, final warning. Her name highlighted in red marker, visible enough that every staff member on 3 shifts would see it within 48 hours. The implication was careful, not an accusation of theft or negligence, but something subtly more damaging. Insubordination. Exceeding scope of practice. The kind of warning that made other nurses wonder if maybe she really had stepped out of line, if maybe she couldn't be trusted with patient care decisions. The night shift coordinator, a woman named Paula who'd given Sarah the November schedule 3 weeks earlier, handed her the revised assignments at 1,530 hours. Isolation rooms only. Patients with infectious precautions. The assignments nobody wanted because they meant gowning and degowning for every intervention, limited family visitation, and the psychologically grinding work of caring for the sickest patients with the most restricted access. Dr. Mercer felt you needed more focused responsibilities, Paula said, not meeting her eyes. Her voice had the hollow quality of someone delivering a message she didn't believe but had been instructed to deliver anyway. Sarah took the assignment sheets without comment. The rooms were listed by number, 412, 414, 521. No mention of room 347 and Colonel Vance. The reassignment served multiple purposes, Sarah realized as she reviewed the schedule. It isolated her from the main unit. It restricted her access to the pharmacy and supply rooms. Mercer had already made that change, she discovered when her badge wouldn't clear the electronic lock. It placed her in wards where she'd be relatively unsupervised but thoroughly documented, creating a paper trail that made her look increasingly unstable and unreliable. It was competent sabotage. The kind that didn't leave fingerprints. That night, Sarah worked her isolation assignments with the same silent efficiency she'd brought to everything else. Room for 12 contained a 78-year-old woman with pneumonia, antibiotics, breathing treatments, gentle encouragement. Room for 14 was a post-surgical patient recovering from appendectomy, pain management, wound assessment, vital sign monitoring. Room 521 was a man in his 50s with a respiratory infection, stable but declining, the kind of case that required constant vigilance and absolutely nothing dramatic. She finished her rounds at 2,345 hours and found herself with 45 minutes of charting before the night shift truly deepened. Her mind kept returning to room 347. To Colonel Vance. To whatever thread she'd been meant to monitor before this entire situation had tilted sideways. At 0055 hours, she made a decision that violated protocol. She accessed the back stairwell, the one that bypassed the main corridor where night shift staff congregated, and climbed to the 3rd floor. Her badge wouldn't open the ICU doors anymore, but she could position herself in the stairwell with a clear sightline to the entrance. She had no rational explanation for what she was about to do. No operational justification. Just the specific weight of something wrong in the air, the way the atmosphere changes before an ambush, before everything becomes violent and necessary. At 0143 hours, she saw them. 2 men in surgical masks and scrubs she didn't recognize, moving through the staff entrance with the wrong kind of purpose. Not the measured pace of medical professionals. Not the tired shuffle of night shift workers. They moved like men with an objective, with a timeline, with consequences attached to failure. The silenced weapon was barely visible beneath the larger one's scrub top. Sarah's hands moved before her mind finished catching up. She stepped out of the stairwell. She positioned her body between the corridor and the men's trajectory. She made eye contact with the nearer one and held it, a single moment of absolute clarity where every calculation she'd made across 12 years and 3 tours collapsed into a single decision: this man would have to go through her to reach that room. The magazine-fed silent suppressor activated with a sound like air escaping from a punctured tire. The round caught her through the left shoulder, spinning her sideways, the impact driving her backward into the forestand beside her. Pain was information. Pain is data. She hit the panic alarm with her functioning hand while dragging Colonel Vance's bed toward the door with her body, blood blooming across her scrubs like a flower opening in fast motion, her vision narrowing down to the specific tactical requirement of putting distance between the colonel and the shooter. The room went dead silent. Not the quiet of peaceful rest. The silence of everything stopping at once, of breath held, of decisions crystallizing, of the world reorganizing itself around a single violent event. And then the screaming started. Sarah's isolation assignments moved like clockwork through the dark hours. Room 347 was not a patient, it was a mission perimeter. She understood this without words, the way her body understood how to move through a hospital corridor without disturbing the sleeping sick, how to change a dressing without letting her hands betray the 18 months of weapons training that lived in her muscle memory. Colonel Vance was a primary concern, a tactical asset that required protection and intelligence gathering, and Sarah had long ago learned to compartmentalize the difference between nursing compassion and military necessity. The chart reviews happened at 2,100 hours. The vitals checks at 0000. The dressing changes on a strict 4-hour cycle because infected trauma wounds didn't care about hospital politics or billing codes. What they cared about was precise technique, sterile field discipline, and hands that knew the difference between tissue that healed and tissue that died. During the midnight dressing change on her 5th night, Sarah worked with the focused efficiency of someone who had packed battle wounds in field tents under mortar fire, her movements economical and practiced. The colonel lay quiet, his breathing steady through the pain, watching her hands work with an intensity that felt different from normal patient observation. She unwrapped the gauze slowly, checking for signs of early infection, no purulent drainage, no fever spike, no smell of necrotic tissue. The wound itself was healing well, the trauma organized and responding to proper care. She was preparing fresh gauze when the colonel whispered, his voice carrying the particular rasp of someone speaking through controlled pain. "You served," he said. Not a question. A statement of fact delivered by someone who recognized the architecture of another person's training. "I can tell by the way you handle tissue under pressure. You're no ordinary nurse." Sarah's hands didn't pause. She continued the dressing change, her jaw tightening perhaps a 1/4 inch, the kind of micro-expression that only registered if you were trained to notice such things. Colonel Marcus Vance was trained to notice. The silence between them stretched long enough for Sarah to secure the final piece of tape, to step back from the bed, to dispose of the used dressing in the biohazard container with mechanical precision. She could have denied it. She should have denied it. Protocol required her to acknowledge nothing, reveal nothing, maintain the fiction that she was exactly what her civilian credentials suggested. "Sleep now," she said instead, her voice keeping its nurse-soft tone. "You're healing well." He didn't respond, but his eyes followed her as she checked the fall line, as she verified the monitor leads were secure, as she moved toward the door with the careful lack of urgency that characterized all her movements. The colonel had seen something in her hands that she couldn't hide, and they both understood the implications of that knowledge. Sarah understood something else. She had exactly 48 hours before whoever had sent those men in surgical masks would send them again, and next time they wouldn't care about the appearance of legitimacy. The nurse's station was quiet at 01:45 when Sarah settled into her charting. The night shift at Seattle General moved like a skeleton crew, 2 nurses covering 15 beds, 1 resident sleeping in the call room, 1 attending physician somewhere in the building reviewing labs that nobody actually needed reviewed at 3 in the morning. The intercom had long since stopped announcing routine pages. The building was in that particular state of late-night consciousness where time moved differently, where minutes felt like hours and the outside world seemed to exist only in the glow of computer screens. Sarah's eyes moved systematically across the monitors from her station, room 342 stable, room 344 drifting, room 346 resting. Room 347 showing the steady cardiac rhythm of someone healing. She was documenting the colonel's O2 saturation when she saw them. 2 men in surgical scrubs, their badges visible but their body language wrong in ways that sent signals directly to the reptile brain that handled threat assessment. They moved through the hallway with the weight forward, The casual confidence of people accustomed to entering secure spaces without question, their eyes scanning not for chart numbers but for obstacles and witnesses. One carried a tablet, the other walked with his hand near his waistband in a way that would have looked natural to civilian observers but looked like weapon positioning to anyone with 18 months of training. Sarah's heart rate didn't change. Her breathing didn't accelerate. Her hands continued documenting vitals with mechanical precision while her mind calculated trajectories and distances and the position of the panic alarm button mounted beneath her desk. They approached the nurse's station with professional smiles. The one with the tablet spoke first, his voice carrying the accent of someone trained in medical terminology but lacking the particular cadence of actual hospital workers. "We have a transfer order for room 347, he said, extending the tablet. "Emergency medical transport to Walter Reed. Orders came through medical command at 0115. Sarah looked at the tablet. The paperwork was perfect, official letterhead, proper military medical codes, authorization signatures that appeared to carry the weight of genuine command structure. She had studied enough hospital systems in her 5 days here to recognize excellent forgery when she saw it. "Transfer orders need nursing verification," she said, rising from her chair with the kind of smooth, unhurried movement that came from tactical training. She positioned her body between them and the hallway that led to room 347, her posture casual, her expression concerned but professional. "Let me confirm with the charge nurse first. We need to ensure his medications are properly documented for transport." The first man smiled the smile of someone whose plans included contingencies. "That won't be necessary. This is a priority medical evacuation." "Then the charge nurse will want to know that," Sarah said. She was moving toward the call button for the charge nurse when she saw it, the way the second man's hand shifted toward his waistband, the way his jacket pulled slightly to reveal a suppressed pistol, compact and businesslike, designed specifically for quiet work in enclosed spaces like hospital hallways at 01:45 in the morning. The weapon was a Ruger Mark IV with an octane suppressor, the kind of tool that military medical evacuation teams definitely did not carry, the kind of tool that ended people. Dr. Mercer emerged from the stairwell at precisely that moment, his timing so perfect it couldn't be coincidence. He was wearing his white coat despite the hour, his silver hair arranged with the kind of precision that suggested he had been awake and present somewhere in the building, waiting for his cue. His expression shifted through concern when he saw Sarah standing between the two men and the colonel's room, then moved into theatrical understanding when he seemed to grasp the situation, or rather, when he seemed to grasp the false situation he had constructed. "Nurse Chen, these gentlemen have proper authorization," he said, his voice carrying the kind of administrative finality that was designed to end conversations. "Step aside. This patient requires emergency transfer." Sarah felt the moment crystallize. She felt the instant where all the possible futures collapsed into a single decision point. She could trigger the panic alarm, but they would shoot Colonel Vance before security arrived, maybe 8 minutes away on a good night, probably 12 on an actual night, definitely too long. She could engage the shooter directly, but she was unarmed and the man with the pistol was trained and close. She could scream, could run, could follow hospital protocol and call for help through proper channels, but protocol didn't account for the fact that the man in charge of hospital security probably had a phone call queued up from Dr. Mercer, that the police chief probably had his own relationship with powerful people, that the system was compromised at every level because the system always was. So Sarah Chen made the decision that Captain Sarah Chen would have made, the one that came from the part of her that had volunteered to serve, that had passed selection, that had trained to sacrifice position and body to protect the people she was assigned to protect. She reached for the panic alarm with her right hand while her body moved sideways toward the doorframe of room 347, throwing herself into the space between the colonel's bed and the hallway in one fluid motion. The moment her body crossed that threshold, she saw the suppressed pistol come clear, saw the barrel begin to track, saw the finger move toward the trigger. The room didn't go silent. There was the terrible hiss of the suppressor firing, the muffled sound like a violent exhalation, like something puncturing. She felt the impact before she heard it, felt the round take her through the left shoulder, felt the spin and the sudden gravity pulling her sideways into the forestand. Pain is information. Pain is data. The training taught that too. She was falling toward the four-stand when her hand found it, when her body struck it, when the metal screamed in protest and the bags of fluid swayed like living things disturbed. Her shoulder was on fire in a way that bypassed thoughts and moved straight into action, her good hand slamming the panic alarm on the wall even as she used her body to block the doorway, to make herself a larger obstacle, to ensure that the next round couldn't reach the man on the bed behind her. Blood bloomed across her scrubs, warm and insistent, but her eyes stayed fixed on Dr. Mercer's face to watch his expression shift from confidence to something approaching panic, to watch him comprehend in that moment that he had made a miscalculation, that Sarah Chen was not a quiet nurse questioning billing codes, that the thing he was looking at was something far more dangerous than he had imagined. The intercom exploded into life. Code Blue, Room 347, Code Blue, emergency response to Room 347. The suppressed shot made a sound like a pneumatic stapler, and Sarah felt the impact punch through her left shoulder, spinning her into the four-stand. Blood bloomed across her scrubs in a spreading flower of crimson as she crashed against the metal pole, the pain white-hot and familiar. She'd been shot before, in Bagram, and her body knew the drill. Her right hand slammed the wall-mounted panic alarm even as she fell, the klaxon erupting through the corridor like a siren demanding the world wake up. With her good arm, she grabbed the colonel's bed rail and dragged it toward the door using her body weight, blood streaming down her arm, placing herself and the bed between the shooters and their firing line. Colonel Vance, suddenly alert, rolled off the far side of his mattress taking cover. The shooters hesitated, the alarm changed everything, security response incoming, witnesses mobilizing. They retreated down the service stairs as Sarah collapsed against the door, her shoulder screaming, vision narrowing to tunnel focus. The pain was information. The blood loss rate, the entry wound angle, the numbness spreading down her arm, all data she could process later if she survived the next 60 seconds. Security arrived in 40 seconds. 2 officers, radios crackling, weapons still holstered because they didn't understand what they were walking into. Sarah managed 3 words through gritted teeth: 2 armed men. Service stairs. Now. But that wasn't the worst part. Dr. Mercer arrived in 90 seconds, and his performance was Oscar-worthy. He took in the scene with a single sweep, Sarah bleeding against the door, the colonel on the floor behind overturned furniture, 2 transport technicians gone, panic alarm wailing overhead. His mind calculated instantly. The narrative had to shift. The witnesses had to be reframed. The threat had to become Sarah herself. She attacked the transfer team, Mercer announced to the arriving security chief, his voice steady as a surgeon's hand. I witnessed her physically assault credentialed medical transport. She's been unstable for days, written warnings, paranoid accusations about billing fraud, and now this psychotic break. Look at her. She's armed herself with aggressive delusions. Sarah tried to push away from the door, tried to speak, but the words came through pain like wading through concrete. They had weapons. Suppressed pistol. The colonel was the target. They came to. You're in shock, Mercer interrupted smoothly, stepping between her and the security officers like a shield, his hand raised in a calming gesture. Adrenaline and blood loss create disorientation. Security, escort her to the ER for immediate psychiatric evaluation. I'm placing her on administrative leave pending investigation. This is a workplace violence incident and protocol requires separation. The security officers exchanged glances. One of them looked at the blood on Sarah's scrubs, looked at her face, and hesitation flickered across his features. But Mercer's authority was like gravity, it bent everything toward his version of truth. He was the chief of surgery. She was the unstable nurse making wild accusations. Sarah saw it happen. Watched the narrative calcify in real time. Watched the officers' postures shift from investigating attackers to managing a psychiatric episode. The colonel tried to speak from the floor, but Mercer was already moving, already orchestrating, already spinning the web that would catch them both. Mercer made 3 phone calls over the next 18 minutes while Sarah's shoulder was hastily bandaged by a confused ER resident who kept apologizing for the pain he was causing, apologizing, as if she were breakable, as if her shoulder wound mattered against the architecture of lies being constructed 3 floors above them. The first call, to the board president at home, voice urgent and concerned. I need to report a violent incident. A night shift nurse attacked medical transport personnel. I witnessed it myself. I'm initiating immediate termination protocols under the Violence in the Workplace clause. Can we get emergency authorization tonight? I want her removed from the building before shift change. The second call, to his personal lawyer, tone businesslike and strategic. I need liability documentation. A nurse assaulted transport staff under my watch. I did everything correctly. I documented, I reported, I separated her immediately. I want our position airtight before legal makes contact. The third call, to a private security firm contact, voice dropping lower. I need someone discreet looking into the nurse. Find anything you can. Disgruntled employee history, psychiatric records, substance abuse. Nothing actionable yet, just building background if this escalates. And if anyone asks questions about tonight, the official line is psychiatric episode, not a security situation. Sarah's badge was deactivated at 02 for 7 hours. Her locker was cleaned out by 0310. The termination paperwork was signed by the board president via phone authorization at 0335, her nursing credential suspended pending investigation, her access to the hospital sealed behind electronic locks that no longer recognized her. By 0400, she was escorted from the building by 2 security officers who wouldn't meet her eyes, her left arm immobilized in a temporary sling, the faded unit patch still sewn inside Colonel Vance's jacket, a detail no one knew mattered, a detail that connected her to something bigger than both of them. She discovered it during intake, that small insignia stitched into the lining, a patch from a unit that officially didn't exist. Nightingale 6. That had been her call sign, once. Before the nursing cover. Before the assignment to monitor a black ops officer in a hospital bed. She tried to explain it to Mercer as they escorted her out, tried to tell him about the patch, about what it meant, about who Colonel Vance really was. But Mercer was already walking away, already making another call, already constructing the next layer of his defense. The patch in his jacket, Sarah said, her voice tight with pain but steady, controlled. It's from the 160th SAW. The Colonel is. You're confused, Mercer said without turning around. The medication. The trauma. You're experiencing paranoid ideation. Your medical leave is effective immediately. He didn't even break stride. She drove home one-handed, blood seeping through the bandage despite the field dressing she'd applied with her teeth and her right hand while sitting in her car in the parking lot. Her entire operation had collapsed in 90 seconds. The Colonel was exposed. Her cover was blown. The mission was compromised. And somehow, impossibly, she was the one being removed from the field. Sarah sat at her kitchen table as dawn broke through the window, her shoulder bandaged with field dressing technique, tight, efficient, painful. The wound throbbed with every heartbeat, and for the first time in years, her hand shook. Not from fear. From restraint. From the pressure of holding everything together while the world decided she was broken. She heard the car pull up before her son Marcus arrived at the door at 0710, home early from his friend's house, key in hand, immediately taking in the scene, his mother at the table, blood on her jacket, her face streaked and hollow. Mom? Why are you home? Is that blood? Sarah couldn't answer. Couldn't explain. Couldn't tell him that his mother's entire career had just been dismantled by a man who'd weaponized her sacrifice against her. She sat there while the morning light found her, her composure finally fracturing, the sobs coming from somewhere deeper than training, deeper than military discipline, deeper than years of compartmentalization. Marcus watched his hero break. And something shifted in him that morning, something that would change everything in the hours to come. Sarah's kitchen table held the weight of everything she couldn't say. Dawn crept through the windows like an apology, painting the tile in shades of grey that matched her exhaustion. Her left shoulder throbbed beneath the hastily wrapped gauze, the bandage already yellowing at the edges where blood had seeped through hours ago. She hadn't slept. Hadn't moved from this chair since she'd limped home before sunrise, her scrubs still damp with the evidence of what Dr. Mercer had convinced everyone was her psychiatric breakdown instead of her bravery. The coffee in front of her had gone cold an hour ago. She stared at it like it held answers. It didn't. Her hands, steady hands that had held lives together in operating theaters across 3 continents, trembled now, but not from fear. From rage. From the knowledge that she'd failed. The colonel was still at Seattle General, still vulnerable, still exposed, and she was sitting in her kitchen bleeding into borrowed bandages while the man who'd shot her faced no consequences because his weapon had been framed as her delusion. That's when Marcus found her. Her 16-year-old son stood in the doorway in his school hoodie, backpack slung over one shoulder, frozen by the sight of his mother at the kitchen table with blood on her neck and tears on her face. Real tears. The kind that shook her whole body because she'd spent 17 years teaching him that heroes didn't break, and now he was watching his hero crumble like old paper. Mom. His voice cracked. Why are you home? You have the night shift. Mom. What happened? Why is there blood? He dropped his backpack. Rushed toward her. Stopped 3 feet away because he'd learned, somehow, that this moment required distance. That his mother needed space even when she was falling apart. Who did this? She couldn't tell him. Not yet. Not until she understood how a man with a silenced weapon had walked into a hospital in surgical scrubs and nearly murdered a United States colonel while she'd been labeled unstable for saving his life. The words lodged in her throat like shrapnel. So she just shook her head and waited for the next disaster to arrive. It came in the form of Colonel Vance, still in his hospital gown, checking himself out against medical advice at 0900 that morning. He didn't make it far. Security found him in the stairwell 3 floors down, moving like a man who'd survived worse than bullet wounds and hospital protocols, which he had. They escorted him back to room 347, but something had shifted in his eyes. He knew. Not everything, but enough. He knew Captain Sarah Chen wasn't a civilian nurse, wasn't unstable, wasn't anything Mercer had claimed. By 14:30, the corridor outside his room had become something else entirely. A Marine captain in dress blue stood reading from a shadow box that contained medals that made hospital staff stop mid-stride. Silver Star. 2 Purple Hearts. Bronze Star with Valor. The captain's voice carried the precision of someone trained to deliver impact through brevity. Captain Sarah Chen saved 12 lives under fire. Bagram, 2019. Solo response to compound breach. 3 hours under sustained fire. She took shrapnel. Kept working. Medevaced wounded personnel while maintaining suppressive fire. Citations for Valor from JSOC Command. Dr. Mercer appeared in the corridor, drawn by the commotion, and his face did something Sarah would have found satisfying if she'd been there to see it. She wasn't. She was at home, still at her kitchen table, still bleeding, still broken. But Marcus was there. He'd gone to the hospital after school, carrying a shadow box his mother didn't know he'd kept, the one she'd forbidden him from bringing anywhere near her civilian life. And when he'd opened it in the main corridor of Seattle General, when he'd shouted, "Mom, they need to see these," to a Marine captain who looked at him with the understanding that only people who'd raised military children could muster, the narrative had shifted. That's when the elevator doors opened and a 2-star general stepped into the hallway. Brigadier General Patrick Holloway, deployed from the Pentagon that morning, rendered a crisp salute to a shadow box held by a 16-year-old and said 5 words that drained all remaining color from Dr. Mercer's face: "I flew here to protect Captain Chen." The Marine captain continued reading, louder now, his voice like a bell that couldn't be unrung: Defense Intelligence Agency. Special Operations Task Force. Bagram 2019. 12 lives saved. 3 hours combat conditions. Continuing duty in civilian assignment to protect ongoing operational security. 2 Pentagon representatives arrived at 1600, moving with the purposeful silence of people who'd done this before. They bypassed Mercer entirely, which seemed to terrify him more than direct confrontation would have. One of them produced a federal subpoena. The other said Sarah's code name, not her rank, not her name, but her operational designation, and Mercer's knees actually buckled. He reached for the wall. Nobody moved to help him. The general watched like he was already writing the report. Sarah was at home when her phone buzzed with a message from a colonel she'd never met directly but recognized from classified briefings. It contained a single link and 3 words, "You should see this." She clicked. A video. Her face burned as she watched Dr. Mercer's patient room humiliation from 18 hours earlier, now viewed 2.3 million times. The comments came faster than she could read them. Nurses comparing Mercer to other abusers they'd survived. Veterans identifying her through the footage, somehow knowing. Military personnel sharing and resharing. By 1900, the video had reached Dr. Patricia Huang, Mercer's medical school mentor, the woman whose recommendation had launched his career at Johns Hopkins. Dr. Huang released a statement that read like a surgical excision, "I am horrified and ashamed that someone I once championed has demonstrated such cruelty and ethical bankruptcy. I formally disavow Dr. Mercer and will be cooperating fully with investigators." That statement triggered the real collapse. An emergency board review convened by 2100. Federal auditors seized records before dawn. They found $4.2 million in fraudulent billing across 3 years. Equipment contracts paid to shell companies. Phantom procedures billed to military insurance. 3 phone calls Mercer had made the night of the shooting, 1 to his lawyer, 1 to the board president, 1 to a private security firm whose technicians were arrested at DFW Airport 6 hours later carrying forged military credentials and unregistered weapons with silencers. Sarah learned about it piecemeal over the next 72 hours. Not from official channels, those came later, but from Marcus, who had become, inexplicably, the unofficial conduit of hospital gossip through his repeated visits to Seattle General. Colonel Vance, promoted to Brigadier General, had made a single phone call to the commandant of her son's Air Force ROT program. By week's end, Marcus had enlisted. By the following week, he wore the same uniform that his mother had hidden beneath scrubs for 3 years. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the Pentagon in full dress uniform, her left shoulder healed beneath the blue fabric, the scar tissue forming a line that ran from her collarbone toward her heart. The dress blues fit like they'd been waiting for her all along. Because they had. They always had. The ceremony room held Brigadier General Marcus Vance, his promotion official now, his survival story classified but his bravery not, and her son in his cadet dress, no longer confused about why his mother had broken at the kitchen table. Behind the podium hung something unexpected, the faded unit patch from Colonel Vance's jacket lining, the one Sarah had discovered during intake at Seattle General, now framed and labeled with a designation that meant nothing to civilians and everything to operators. General Vance pinned the Defense Meritorious Service Medal on her chest. His hands were steady. Scarred. The hands of a man who'd learned pain was information. Captain Chen's undercover operation dismantled a fraud network spanning 12 military treatment facilities, he read, his voice carrying through the room like a command. Recovery of $47 million. Proper care insured for 3,000 veterans. She took a bullet defending this mission. She succeeded despite complete cover compromise. She exemplifies silent service. The applause came from people who understood what silence cost. Veterans. Officers. Special operations personnel who recognized the specific exhaustion of people who'd carried secrets that never got told. Marcus watched his mother receive honors she'd never sought, and something shifted in his understanding of what heroism actually meant. It meant bleeding into a hastily wrapped bandage. It meant breaking at a kitchen table when nobody was watching. It meant standing at attention in the Pentagon while the world finally knew a fraction of the truth. That afternoon, Sarah drove past a rural free clinic on the outskirts of San Antonio. Through the chain-link fence surrounding the property, she saw Dr. Mercer loading boxes into a medical supply van, wearing cargo pants and a polo shirt instead of surgical scrubs. His medical license permanently revoked. His reputation destroyed. His plea deal finalized, full cooperation, 5 years federal prison, community service in perpetuity. His hands, once valued at millions, now sorted donated supplies at minimum wage because that's what happens when you prioritize fraud over the lives of soldiers who bled defending your right to exist. He didn't look up as she passed. The Pentagon reception afterward was precise and formal. Officers in dress blues. Commendations on every wall. General Vance presented Sarah with the framed unit patch, the one she'd identified during intake, the one that had marked Colonel Vance as something beyond conventional military. "You bled for secrets worth keeping," he said quietly. "Some of those secrets will never be declassified. But we know. That's enough." The reception coordinator asked Sarah if she wanted to say anything to the assembled officers. She smiled slightly, a rare thing, barely visible, and shook her head. Remained characteristically silent. Let the quiet speak for itself. Because the general understood what she'd learned in 3 years of posing as invisible, words were for people who didn't know how to act. General Vance spoke instead. His final words to the room, to the assembled decorated officers who represented the structure that had almost buried her: "Remember this. Remember this always." The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. The words hung in the air like a prayer nobody had taught them. Like and subscribe if you believe nurses deserve more respect. And tell me honestly, what would you have done in her shoes? I'm pinning the best answer.